Who are you? Those three words stopped every conversation in the boardroom. 22 executives turned toward the elderly man standing beside the glass wall. His expensive navy suit fit him perfectly, but the confidence he had worn into the room had already begun to crack. He looked directly at me. "I asked you a question," he repeated. "Who are you and why are you sitting in the CEO's chair?" "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old." And the man asking that question was my father. The same father who had spent most of my life telling me I would never become anything because I refused to follow the career he had chosen for me. He had spent 10 years introducing my older brother as my successful son. He had spent 10 years introducing me as the one who still hasn't figured life out. He had no idea that the company preparing to purchase my brother's collapsing business was mine. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and the city you're watching from in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. Now let me tell you how a single decision changed the course of my life. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. We lived in a 2-story brick house that looked larger than it really was. My father believed appearances mattered almost as much as reality. The lawn was trimmed every Saturday at exactly 8 in the morning. The mailbox was repainted every spring whether it needed it or not. The driveway was washed twice a month. From the street, we looked like the perfect family. Inside the house, things were much more complicated. My father, Richard Carter, was 48 when I graduated from high school. He had built a respected accounting firm with 23 employees and more than 400 business clients across central Ohio. He wasn't born wealthy. His father had worked in a steel factory for 38 years, and every dollar Richard earned felt like proof that hard work always produced success. Because of that belief, he trusted only careers he could measure. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, certified accountants. If your salary could be predicted before you even started college, he respected it. If it couldn't, he considered it a hobby. My older brother, Michael, was everything Dad wanted. 3 years older than me. Captain of the debate team. Graduated high school with a 4 GPA. Accepted into one of the state's best business schools. By 24, he was already managing regional operations for a manufacturing company with nearly 200 employees. Every achievement became another family story. At Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at birthdays, Dad would smile proudly. Michael negotiated a contract worth $2.4 million this quarter. Everyone would clap. Everyone would smile. Then someone would politely ask what I had been doing. I finished another software project, I'd say. The room usually became quiet. Someone changed the subject. Because nobody really understood what I meant. The truth was that I had fallen in love with computers when I was 11 years old. Not because they were fashionable. Not because they promised money. Because they solved problems. Our middle school had received 12 outdated computers from a company upgrading its office equipment. Most students complained they were slow. I took one apart. Piece by piece. I spent 3 weeks after school learning how every component worked. The school librarian eventually gave me permission to borrow old programming books that were already scheduled to be thrown away. They were almost 15 years old, but to me they felt priceless. While other kids memorized baseball statistics, I memorized programming languages. By 16, I had built websites for 5 local businesses. Each one paid between $400 and $800. I saved every cent. By graduation, I had earned just over $14,000 doing freelance work from my bedroom. To my father, none of it counted. Real businesses have offices, he'd say. Real professionals wear ties. Real careers don't disappear when technology changes. At first I argued. Then I explained. Eventually, I simply stopped talking about my work. One afternoon during my senior year of high school, Dad found me rebuilding an old desktop computer in the garage. He leaned against the doorway and watched silently for nearly a minute. Then he laughed. "You know what your problem is." I looked up. "You keep fixing machines because it's easier than dealing with people." I didn't answer. "You'll learn eventually. Businesses are built by relationships, not keyboards." He walked away before I could respond. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not because I believed it. Because I realized he had never actually asked why I loved what I did. He had only judged it. My mother, Susan, tried to keep peace inside the house. She was gentle, patient, the kind of person who apologized even when someone else stepped on her foot. She understood both of us better than either of us understood ourselves. Late one evening, while helping her wash dishes, she quietly asked me, "Are you sure this is the life you want?" "I've never been more sure." She smiled sadly. "Then don't spend your life trying to convince your father. Some people need years before they can see what someone else already knows." At the time, I thought she was simply comforting me. Years later, I realized she had been predicting the future. The hardest part about living in our house wasn't the criticism. It was the comparison. Everything became a competition I never agreed to enter. If Michael received a promotion, Dad would somehow connect it to me. You see what happens when someone commits to a real career. If Michael bought a newer car, financial stability comes from making sensible choices. If Michael closed on his first house at 27, planning ahead always beats chasing dreams. None of those comments sounded cruel on the surface. That was what made them so effective. They were delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, as though they were simply observations instead of judgments. I usually nodded, finished my dinner, and excused myself before saying something I'd regret. My childhood bedroom slowly became my office. The walls were covered with whiteboards instead of posters. Sticky notes filled with ideas stretched across one corner of the room. I had 2 second-hand monitors sitting on an old wooden desk my grandfather had built decades earlier. The computer wasn't impressive to anyone else. To me, it represented possibility. Every freelance project taught me something new. One client wanted an inventory system. Another needed appointment scheduling. A small delivery company hired me to build software that reduced the time drivers spent planning routes. The project paid only $3,200. But it saved the company nearly 30 hours of labor every month. That was the first time I realized software didn't just perform tasks. It changed businesses. I became obsessed with solving practical problems. Not flashy ideas. Useful ones. Dad couldn't understand that. One Sunday afternoon, several relatives gathered for my grandmother's 75th birthday. After lunch, everyone sat in the backyard while children played nearby. Uncle Frank asked the question I had learned to expect. "So Daniel, what exactly are you doing these days?" Before I could answer, Dad smiled. He's still experimenting with computers. A few people chuckled politely. I forced a smile. "I actually have 16 paying clients now." Dad shrugged. "Temporary work." Then he pointed toward Michael. "Your cousin should ask Michael for career advice instead. He's managing real operations now." Michael looked uncomfortable. He wasn't a bad person. In fact, he often tried to redirect the conversation. "Dad, Daniel's actually really talented." "I'm sure he is," Dad replied. "But talent isn't the same thing as building a future." Nobody argued. The conversation moved on. But I noticed something that day. Michael avoided looking at me. Not because he looked down on me. Because he was embarrassed for me. Or maybe embarrassed for our father. That memory reminded me of something from childhood. I was 8 years old. Michael was 11. Dad had entered us in a neighborhood Pinewood Derby race. Michael spent 2 weeks carefully following every instruction in the official guide. Dad helped him every evening. They measured every angle, checked every wheel, polished every surface. I built mine differently. I carved a strange-looking shape after reading a library book about airflow. Dad laughed. That's not how winners build cars. Race day arrived. Michael finished second. My little wooden car crossed the finish line first. I still remember holding the trophy. I expected Dad to smile. Instead, he examined the car. You probably just got lucky. That was the first time I learned something important. Some people become so attached to being right that evidence no longer changes their minds. As the years passed, I stopped trying to earn his approval. Instead, I focused on earning my clients' trust. By 24, I had registered Carter Logic Solutions from a tiny rented office above an old insurance agency. The office measured just under 400 square feet. The carpet was faded. The windows leaked cold air during winter. I owned 3 desks, 2 laptops, 1 coffee maker that barely worked, and exactly $18,700 left in the company bank account after paying every expense. Most people would have called it a small business. To me, it felt enormous. Because for the first time, the future belonged to me, not to my father's expectations. The first year was far less glamorous than people imagine when they hear the words, "He started a company." There were no dramatic celebrations. No investors writing enormous checks. No magazine interviews. There were weeks when I worked 90 hours and still wondered whether I would have enough money to cover payroll. I became the receptionist in the morning, the programmer during the afternoon, the customer support department after dinner, and the janitor before I locked the office each night. My first employee was a former classmate named Ethan. He had turned down a higher-paying corporate job because he believed in what we were building. I'd rather help build something than maintain something, he told me on his first day. His salary was modest. Mine was even smaller. For nearly 18 months, Ethan earned more money than I did because I kept putting every extra dollar back into the business. Some nights we ordered 1 large pizza and stretched it across 2 meals. Other nights we survived on coffee and vending machine snacks. Yet neither of us complained. Every satisfied client felt like proof that we were moving in the right direction. By the end of our second year, we had grown from 16 clients to 63. Our annual revenue crossed $940,000. Not millions. Not enough to impress people like my father. But enough to hire 6 full-time employees. Enough to move into a proper office. Enough to believe we had a future. Dad barely acknowledged it. Whenever someone mentioned my company, he asked only one question. So, when are you going to get a real executive position? I used to laugh. Eventually, I stopped. One Christmas Eve, our entire family gathered around my parents' dining table. Michael had just been featured in a regional business magazine. Dad passed the magazine around like it was a family heirloom. "Read the article," he said proudly. "They're calling him one of the brightest young business leaders in the state." Everyone congratulated Michael. He thanked them politely. Then my aunt turned toward me. "And how's your business going, Daniel?" Before I could answer, Dad smiled. "Still small. Just 2 words. Still small." He had no idea that we had finished our biggest contract only 3 days earlier. A logistics company operating in 5 states had signed a 3-year agreement worth $3.8 million. It was more revenue than my father had ever generated in a single year. I could have corrected him. I didn't. Not because I was afraid. Because I had finally realized something. People who measure your worth before hearing your story rarely change their opinion after hearing your success. So I simply said, "It's going well." Dad nodded as though that settled the matter. Michael caught my eye across the table. There was something different in his expression. Not pity anymore. Curiosity. Later that evening, while everyone else watched an old movie in the living room, he stepped onto the back porch where I was standing. "You really signed a big contract, didn't you?" I smiled. "Who told you?" "I overheard Mom talking to Aunt Linda." He leaned against the railing. "You know, I've always wondered why you never defend yourself." I looked out at the snow covering the backyard. "Would it matter?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally he sighed. "Probably not." That silence told me more than any speech could have. For the first time in years, my brother understood what I had been carrying. He wasn't responsible for Dad's comparisons. He had benefited from them. But that wasn't the same thing. Before going back inside, he said quietly, "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words meant more than he probably realized. Because they came without competition. Without comparison. Without needing someone else to lose first. As Carter Logic Solutions entered its 5th year, everything began accelerating. One satisfied client recommended us to another. That company referred 2 more. Then an industry association invited me to speak about workflow automation. I almost declined. Public speaking terrified me. Ethan laughed. "You explain complicated software to frustrated clients every day. You'll survive one presentation." He was right. The conference audience wasn't interested in polished speeches. They wanted practical solutions. For 45 minutes, I walked them through real examples of companies that had reduced operating costs without laying off employees. Afterward, 12 executives stayed behind asking questions. Within 6 months, 5 of them became clients. That single presentation generated nearly $6 million in long-term contracts. Success didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one conversation. One recommendation. One solved problem at a time. And while my company quietly kept growing, someone else's business was beginning to crack. I just didn't know whose it was yet. The first hint came from my mother. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was driving home from the office. "Are you busy?" "I can talk." She hesitated for a moment. "Your brother has been under a lot of pressure." That sentence alone told me something was wrong. My mother never discussed anyone else's problems unless she believed they had become too heavy to carry alone. "What happened?" "He left his old company last year." "I know. He bought a manufacturing business with 2 partners." I hadn't heard that part. Michael and I talked only a few times each year. Not because we disliked each other. Life had simply taken us in different directions. "How's it going?" I asked. Another pause. "Not as well as everyone expected." I could hear the concern in her voice. The economy changed, several large customers cancelled contracts, costs kept increasing. I nodded quietly, even though she couldn't see me. Those things happened more often than people realized. From the outside, businesses looked stable. Inside, many survived one difficult quarter at a time. "Is he going to be okay?" "I hope so." That answer stayed with me for the rest of the evening. A week later, I attended a regional business conference. During lunch, an investment banker I knew casually sat beside me. He mentioned a manufacturing company that had been looking for buyers. "The owners waited too long," he said. "Now they're running out of options." "What company?" He told me the names. I nearly dropped my coffee. It was Michael's business. I didn't react. Instead, I asked a few careful questions. The banker wasn't sharing confidential information. Everything he discussed was already circulating among lenders and industry advisors. Sales had fallen for 3 consecutive years. Debt payments were becoming difficult. Suppliers had shortened payment terms. Several experienced employees had already resigned. None of those problems guaranteed failure. Together, they painted a worrying picture. That evening I sat alone in my office, long after everyone else had gone home. Not because I wanted to buy Michael's company. Because I couldn't stop thinking about him. I remembered the Christmas conversation. "I'm proud of you." He had meant it. He had never mocked my career. He had never called me a failure. He had simply lived under the same expectations I had. The difference was, his path matched Dad's definition of success. Mine didn't. For the first time, I wondered whether Michael had ever truly chosen his own dream. Or whether he had inherited someone else's. A month later, our executive team gathered for our quarterly strategy meeting. Our chief financial officer projected several acquisition opportunities onto the large conference screen. "We've identified 4 software firms," she said, "and 1 manufacturing technology company." I looked more closely. It was Michael's business. Not because they built products we wanted. Because they owned proprietary automation systems that perfectly complemented our software platform. From a business perspective, the acquisition made sense. From a personal perspective, it felt impossible. The room waited for my opinion. No one else knew the connection. I closed the folder. I'll review everything personally. Over the next 2 weeks, I studied every report. Every balance sheet. Every customer contract. Every risk assessment. I forced myself to ignore one simple fact. The owner's last name matched mine. Instead, I evaluated the company exactly as I would any other opportunity. Strength, weaknesses, future potential. When the analysis was complete, the conclusion surprised even me. The business itself wasn't broken. Its finances were. The products were respected. The employees were talented. The technology was valuable. They simply needed stronger leadership, better systems, and capital they no longer had. The acquisition recommendation received unanimous approval from our board. No one celebrated. Acquisitions weren't victories. They were responsibilities. Because behind every spreadsheet were families, employees, careers, dreams. As the legal teams prepared the first formal meeting with the owners, I sat alone in my office staring at the city skyline. After nearly 10 years, the paths my father had compared every single day were finally about to cross again. Only this time, neither of us would be meeting as sons. We would be meeting as business leaders. And neither my father nor my brother had any idea who would be sitting at the head of the table. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. For almost a week, my executive assistant asked the same question every day. "Would you like me to inform TH?" The acquisition officially closed 53 days later. By then, the paperwork filled 6 large binders. There had been dozens of conference calls, countless revisions, financial audits, regulatory reviews, and enough signatures to make my wrist ache just looking at them. When people read headlines announcing that one company had acquired another, they usually imagined a single dramatic meeting. The truth was much quieter. Success was finalized through patience, not applause. On the first Monday after the deal became official, I visited Michael's headquarters for the first time as its new owner. The parking lot looked exactly as it always had. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups. Forklifts moved pallets across the warehouse. Phones rang. Customers placed orders. Life continued. That was intentional. One of the promises I had made during negotiations was that the acquisition would create stability, not chaos. The employees deserved that. Many of them had spent 20 or 30 years building the company. Their livelihoods shouldn't become casualties of someone else's financial mistakes. We gathered everyone in the warehouse just before 9 in the morning. Nearly 140 employees stood in small groups, whispering to one another. Some looked nervous. Others simply looked tired. I stepped onto a small platform beside Michael. He spoke first. I know many of you are worried about what today means. He paused, looking across familiar faces. So was I. A few people smiled. But after working with Carter Logic Solutions over the past several weeks, I believe this company has found the right partner. Then he turned toward me. Daniel. I walked forward. I'll keep this brief. The warehouse became completely quiet. No one comes to work hopping to spend the day worrying about headlines. A few people nodded. You come here to support your families. You come here because your work matters. My responsibility is simple. Give you the tools to succeed. Protect the parts of this company worth protecting. And help build the future instead of spending every day talking about the past. There was no dramatic applause. Just something better. Relief. You could almost feel it moving through the room. Afterward, employees lined up to introduce themselves. Some had worked there longer than I had been alive. Others had joined only months earlier. One machinist in his early 60s shook my hand firmly. I've been through 3 ownership changes. He smiled. This is the first one where the new owner talked about people before profits. I thanked him. But inside I thought about my mother. She had taught me that lesson years before I ever realized I was learning it. Later that afternoon, Michael and I walked through the production floor together. He pointed out equipment that needed replacing. Employees who deserved promotions. Processes that had quietly become inefficient over time. There was no resentment. No competition. Just 2 business owners trying to solve problems together. Finally, he stopped beside one of the older assembly lines. You know something funny? What? For years Dad thought I was the successful son. I smiled faintly. And I spent half my career wishing I had your freedom. I looked at him. What do you mean? You chose your own path. I chose the one everyone expected. His words lingered between us. I don't regret my career, he continued. But I do wonder sometimes. He looked across the warehouse. Whether I ever asked myself what I actually wanted. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Some questions don't have immediate answers. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. It was the first family meal since the acquisition became public. Everything looked familiar. The same dining table. The same framed family photographs. The same grandfather clock quietly marking the seconds. But the atmosphere had changed. Dad no longer introduced us. He no longer compared us. When neighbors asked about his sons, he simply smiled and said, I'm proud of both of them. It was a small sentence. 8 words. But it had taken him almost 20 years to learn how to say them. After dinner, while my mother cleared the dishes, Dad asked if we could sit on the back porch. The summer air was warm. Crickets filled the silence between us. He looked out across the backyard before speaking. I keep thinking about that Pinewood Derby race. I laughed quietly. You remember that? I remember everything. He sighed. You won. Yes. And I told myself it was luck. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I've done that more than once in my life. I didn't answer. I confused familiar with correct. His voice was steady. I thought the safest road was automatically the best one. Then he looked directly at me. You didn't prove me wrong because you argued with me. You proved me wrong because you kept building. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive through a perfect apology. Sometimes it arrives when 2 people finally stop trying to win and start trying to understand. Over the next 18 months, the integration between our two companies became one of the most rewarding chapters of my career. Not because every decision was easy. Far from it. There were disagreements, unexpected costs, software systems that refused to communicate with one another. Production schedules had to be redesigned. Entire departments had to learn new processes. Some days it felt as though we were rebuilding an airplane while it was already in the air. But something remarkable happened. The people who had once worked for separate companies slowly stopped thinking of themselves that way. Engineers from my software division began spending time inside the manufacturing facilities. Factory supervisors started suggesting improvements to our development teams. Ideas moved faster. Problems were solved sooner. Instead of asking, whose department is responsible? People started asking, how do we fix it together? That change couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. Yet it became the most valuable result of the entire acquisition. Exactly 1 year after the deal closed, we held our annual leadership conference. Managers from every office gathered in one large auditorium. Nearly 400 employees attended. As I stood backstage waiting to speak, I noticed Michael reviewing his notes. He smiled. Nervous. A little. He laughed. You still get nervous. Every single time. I thought CEOs outgrew that. No, you just learn not to let fear make decisions. He nodded thoughtfully. I wish I'd learned that earlier. When my name was announced, I walked onto the stage. The applause lasted only a few seconds. Then the room became quiet. I looked across hundreds of faces. Some had been with us for 10 years. Others had joined only recently. All of them had helped build something larger than any one person. I've been asked many times what the biggest lesson of my career has been. I paused. People expect me to say innovation. A few smiled. Or technology. Someone laughed softly. But neither answer would be true. I looked toward the front row where Michael was sitting. The biggest lesson is that talent grows where trust exists. If people spend all their energy proving themselves, they have very little energy left to improve themselves. The room remained silent. When someone is trusted, they begin taking risks. They share ideas. They admit mistakes earlier. They become better. And companies become better with them. When I finished, the applause felt genuine. Not because the speech was extraordinary. Because everyone in the room had lived those changes together. After the conference, an elderly employee approached me. He introduced himself as Harold. He had worked in manufacturing for 37 years. I wanted to tell you something. I'm listening. I almost retired before the acquisition. Really? I thought new ownership would push older employees aside. He smiled. Instead, they asked me to mentor younger technicians. His eyes became slightly emotional. You gave me another purpose. I shook his hand firmly. No, you earned it. Driving home that evening, I thought about how different success looked compared to what I had imagined in my 20s. Back then, I thought success meant proving my father wrong. Standing in that boardroom, watching him realize the truth. For years, I believed that moment would be the greatest victory of my life. I had been mistaken. The boardroom lasted less than 5 minutes. Building something that improved hundreds of lives. That lasted every single day. Eventually, newspapers stopped mentioning the acquisition. Clients stopped asking about it. Business moved forward. Life moved forward. The dramatic moment everyone would remember quietly became history. The work remained. A few months later, my father invited both Michael and me to lunch. Just the 3 of us. No holidays. No birthdays. No special occasion. Halfway through the meal, he smiled awkwardly. I have a confession. Michael and I looked at each other. What is it? I've been reading books about entrepreneurship. Michael laughed. You? Dad nodded. I discovered something embarrassing. What? There are dozens of successful paths I spent my whole life ignoring. I couldn't help smiling. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten notes. Business models, leadership ideas, technology trends, questions. So, he looked at me almost sheepishly. I was wondering if you'd recommend a few more books. For years, he had been my teacher. Now, he was asking to become my student. There wasn't a trace of humiliation in that moment. Only growth. I wrote down 6 titles on the last page of his notebook. He folded it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Thank you. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized something that had taken me decades to understand. The opposite of failure isn't success. It's learning. The day someone believes they already know everything, they stop growing. The day they're willing to admit they might be wrong, a new future becomes possible. That was true for my father. It had been true for me. And perhaps it is true for all of us. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because you chose a different path from what others expected? I'd love to read your story. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about quiet justice, resilience and proving your worth through actions instead of arguments, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one. About 6 months after that lunch, something happened that reminded me how deeply old habits can shape a family. My father called early on a Saturday morning. Can you come by the office? His accounting firm had occupied the same brick building for almost 30 years. The reception desk hadn't changed. Neither had the framed certificates hanging along the hallway. Even the coffee machine in the break room looked familiar. When I walked into his office, he was staring at a financial report. I need another opinion. That sentence surprised me more than anything else. There had been a time when my opinion wasn't something he wanted. Now he was asking for it before making an important decision. I sat across from him. What are we looking at? He slid the papers across the desk. One of his longtime clients was considering expanding into a new market. The numbers looked reasonable. The strategy looked conservative. The risks were manageable. Dad waited patiently while I read everything. Finally I asked, "What worries you?" He smiled. 10 years ago, I would have looked only at the balance sheet. And now I'm wondering about the people leading the company. I looked up. He continued, "You taught me something without realizing it. Businesses don't succeed because spreadsheets are perfect. They succeed because people solve problems." I laughed softly. I think Mom taught both of us that. He smiled. You're probably right. We spent nearly 2 hours discussing hiring plans, technology investments, and long-term strategy. Not once did he treat me like the son who needed guidance. He treated me like another professional. Oddly enough, that felt better than any apology. Respect earned quietly always lasts longer than praise offered out of guilt. A few weeks later, my mother invited everyone to celebrate her 70th birthday. Nearly 40 relatives filled the backyard. Children chased each other between tables. My cousins argued over card games. Someone had brought a guitar. The atmosphere felt lighter than family gatherings used to. At one point, my Uncle Frank, the same uncle who years earlier had asked what I was really doing with my life, walked over carrying a plate of barbecue. "I owe you one." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "I used to think your father was right." He laughed awkwardly. "I didn't understand your work. Most people didn't. Now my company uses software your team built." I smiled. "How's it working?" We've cut paperwork by almost 60%. He shook his head. I spent years making jokes about computers. He looked genuinely embarrassed. I guess I wasn't laughing at computers. What were you laughing at? Anything I didn't understand. That answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. People often criticize unfamiliar paths not because they're bad, but because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. Later that afternoon, I noticed my father talking with several younger cousins who were preparing for college. One wanted to study animation. Another dreamed of becoming an environmental scientist. A third hoped to start a small online business. Years earlier, Dad would have redirected every one of them toward accounting, engineering, or law. Instead, I heard him ask a different question. What problem do you want to solve? Each cousin answered differently. He listened carefully to every one of them. No lectures. No comparisons. Just questions. When they walked away, my mother quietly joined me. You noticed? I did. She smiled. He finally stopped trying to write everyone else's story. I looked across the yard at my father. For years, I had imagined justice as a dramatic moment. A public realization. A shocking reversal. Instead, the greatest reward wasn't watching him discover my success. It was watching him stop limiting someone else's future because of his old beliefs. That was the real ending. Not revenge. Growth. Because when one person's perspective changes, sometimes an entire family's future changes with it. And looking back now, that's worth far more than winning any argument ever could. Nearly 3 years after the acquisition, I found myself standing in front of a group of graduating university students. There were almost 800 of them. Some wore expressions of excitement. Others looked terrified. I understood both feelings. The university had invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and leadership. When the invitation first arrived, I almost declined. Not because I didn't appreciate the honor. Because every time I stood behind a podium, I remembered the 18-year-old version of myself sitting at my parents' dinner table, quietly listening while everyone else decided what success was supposed to look like. The dean introduced me with a list of accomplishments that honestly made me uncomfortable. Company revenues, employee growth, industry awards, international clients. When he finally stepped away from the microphone, the applause faded. I looked across the auditorium. Then I smiled. I want to disappoint you for a moment. The students laughed. I've just been introduced as someone who built a successful company. I paused. But none of those numbers explain the most important part of my journey. The room became quiet. When I was your age, the people who loved me most believed I was making the biggest mistake of my life. No one moved. They weren't trying to destroy my future. They were trying to protect me from the future they feared. I could see students writing notes. Parents sitting in the audience exchanged glances. The difficult part about becoming an adult isn't deciding what you want. It's accepting that people who genuinely care about you may not always understand why you want it. For almost an hour I answered questions. Not about software. Not about acquisitions. About doubt. Failure. Family expectations. One student stood near the back of the auditorium. My parents think I should become a doctor. What do you want? I'm studying industrial design. The audience laughed gently. He didn't. They think I'm wasting my education. I smiled because I recognized the expression on his face. I can't tell you which career is right. But I can tell you this. Choose a path because you're willing to do the difficult work it requires. Not because someone else will be proud of the title. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was thoughtful. After the event ended, dozens of students formed a line. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted career advice. One young woman simply shook my hand. My father is exactly like yours. I smiled sadly. I hope your story ends even better. So do I. As I walked toward the parking lot, I noticed someone waiting beside my car. It was my father. He had attended the speech without telling me. I didn't want to distract you, he said. You came. He nodded. I wanted to hear the version of the story you tell strangers. And he smiled. You were kinder to me than I deserved. I looked at him for a moment. No, I was honest. He nodded slowly. I know. Then he looked toward the university building. I kept expecting you to tell everyone how wrong I was. I almost did. He laughed quietly. What stopped you? I thought about the answer before speaking. Because that's no longer the story. What is? I looked across the campus, where graduates were celebrating with their families. The story isn't that you underestimated me. It's that both of us kept growing. He didn't respond immediately. Finally, he placed a hand on my shoulder. I like your version better. So did I. Because revenge had never built my company. Resentment had never signed a client. Anger had never inspired an employee. The things that changed my life were much quieter. Consistency, curiosity, patience, and the willingness to keep building even when the people closest to me couldn't yet see what I was trying to create. Looking back now, I don't remember every criticism. I don't remember every comparison. Those memories faded with time. What I remember are the people who believed in me when success was still invisible. My mother, Ethan, the first clients who trusted a young man working from a tiny rented office. The employees who joined when there were no guarantees. My brother, who eventually chose respect over rivalry. And even my father, who proved that it's never too late for someone to change. People often ask me what the most satisfying moment of my life was. They expect me to say it was sitting at the head of that boardroom table, while my father realized the company buying my brother's business belonged to me. The truth, sir,